Hey guys, so I am losing my voice, so I apologize in advance for any vocal weirdness while I'm walking this through. But we're going to talk about the first section of chapter 12 today, which is all about studies. I don't know why I just did that. Okay, moving on. This icebreaker, you can screenshot this and try this with some other people in your life or just by yourself, whatever. But either way, it's getting you to think about real life examples of how things are related, things that go together, like fire and water, health and fitness, etc. Um, Either they can move together, like more fitness equals more health, or they can move in opposite directions, like more water equals less fire. So just thinking of some real life examples of that to kind of get you in the right frame of mind. There are um, only 5 learning objectives in this chapter. So here are the 5 right now. And this first section is going to introduce you to correlational. We've already kind of talked about correlational a little bit. So this is just kind of a more in-depth introduction. This is going to cover learning objective number 1, which is to um, talk about the goal and purpose of correlational research and the differences between correlational, experimental, and differential studies or strategies. So remember in chapter 6, to review, we talked about 5 basic strategies for investigating variables and the relationships between them. And we've talked about the first 3 already: experimental, non experimental, and quasi experimental. And the other 2 are correlational and descriptive. And so this week we're going to talk about correlational. Um, so remember, in what we've talked about before, or probably what you've gathered from what we have seen, the main part of correlational research is that we're looking for relationships between variables, right? Now, that is true for a lot of possible strategies and studies, but here we're only looking at one group of participants, and we're looking at the scores, looking for patterns in the scores for 2 variables. So there's going to be scores for 2 variables instead of 1 variable like we've been used to, where we only measure 1 variable. Um, so, um, it can be any 2 variables that you want to see if there's a relationship between. An example your book gives is um, amount of sleep versus amount of time at work and how those are related, or amount of time at work versus, or just see if it's related to anxiety or feeling overwhelmed. Um, so things like that, like just to see if they are related. And by related, again, most of the time we're referring to whether they move together in some way. So either as one goes up, the other goes up; as one increases, the other increases; or as one, or decreases together; or they can move in opposite directions. So as one goes up, one goes down, and vice versa. If they are moving together, then there is obviously some sort of relationship between them. So, um, again, what is the goal of correlational research strategy? To establish a relationship and to describe the nature of the relationship, which is what I was just talking about, whether they move up and down together or in opposite directions. Um, so we're describing the nature of it, but we are not explaining it, right? They're not offering an explanation. And there's certainly no cause and effect decisions or conclusions made here either. We are simply describing, we're saying a relationship exists and here's what it looks like. We're not saying why or how or anything like that. There's also no attempt to manipulate, control, or interfere with the variables at all. You literally are just measuring them, period, right? Measuring them as they are. So that is obviously different from what we've been talking about previously. So, or well, hold on, let me go back to this slide real quick before we go to that. So the example your book gave is that there's 2 measurements for each variable, which I mentioned before. So instead of just measuring a dependent variable like we have previously, we're going to measure both variables that we're interested in. The setting doesn't really matter. It can be laboratory or um, in a more natural setting. It doesn't matter. The main thing is that we're measuring both variables. The two examples your book gives to show this is that you could measure students in a classroom in their natural setting. You could measure on-task behavior and grades and see how those two things are related. Or you could go into a laboratory and measure food consumption and activity levels in lab rats and compare those two variables. Um, we're literally just looking at the two sets of scores for the two variables to see if there's any pattern, any consistency of a relationship between the two variables, the scores on the two variables. Okay. And you'll see there's, as you can see, there's only one group. We're not separating into groups. There's literally just one group of participants, and we're measuring them on both variables. And then we're seeing if there's a relationship between those measurements. So, in your book, it gives an example of how to compare correlational and experimental research. So, as I've kind of already mentioned, correlational research, we're just looking for a relationship. We're trying to describe it. We're not explaining how or why. So, we're not looking for cause and effect. We're just trying to see if one exists and then say, here's what it looks like. Experimental is trying to get at the cause and effect. It is trying to demonstrate a cause and effect relationship. That's why we manipulate. That's why we change one of the variables to see if it makes a difference in the second variable, right? That we're looking for a cause and effect relationship in those situations. So we're, again, main difference in how it looks is that in correlational, we're measuring both variables. So we have measurements for both variables from all participants. There's no manipulation or interference with the variables. In experimental research, on the other hand, we're measuring one variable, our dependent variable, and we're using the other variable, our independent variable, to create groups in our participants. And we're comparing those two groups of participants, or three groups or whatever, on our measurement of our dependent variable. And by comparing those groups, the scores for those groups, and by, of course, manipulating it, and interfering there, we're trying to see if, again, if the change that we made in the independent variable in those groups from one group to the other, does that make a difference on the dependent variable? Again, that's to determine that cause and effect relationship. So in the example your book gives, chapter 6, it talks about, we talked about GPA and time spent on Facebook, and in college students. So they measured how much time they spent on Facebook, or maybe they reported, it didn't really say how much time they spent on Facebook. And then they wanted to see if that was related to their GPA scores, or their GPA. So that correlational study found a relationship there, that the more time they spent on Facebook, the lower their GPA was. Now, that's just showing you there's a relationship there. As time on Facebook increased, GPA decreased. So there's a negative correlational relationship there. Or you could flip it around and say it the other way. As time on Facebook decreased, GPA increased. Or you could even flip the variables and say the higher GPA students spent less time on Facebook, or the lower GPA students spent more time on Facebook. You can say it any directions, because it's not a cause and effect thing. It's not a directional thing, right? It's just a relationship. You're just showing that they are moving together in some way. It does not attempt to explain why this exists, and it would be an incorrect conclusion to say that one is causing the other. To say more time on Facebook is causing lower GPA, or or even the other way around, lower GPA is causing more time on Facebook. Either way would not be appropriate based on a correlational study. Now, if we wanted to study this in a experimental way, we could manipulate the time they spent on Facebook, and see if it affected their academic performance on a test of some sort. And so we could, or they're learning, we could manipulate, um, we could have, we would separate them into groups, right? Because again, with experimental, they're in groups. And we could say, this group is going to spend X amount of time on Facebook a day. This group's going to spend less time on Facebook a day, a certain amount. You could say, an hour a day or 30 minutes or whatever. And then the last group would spend no time on Facebook for, the whole day. And you could have them, study some sort of material, and, test their memory or test their learning of that material or whatever it was you wanted to study. Um, so you could do that in an experimental way, but you see how that's very different because one, we have to manipulate, but two, we also have to create groups and compare the groups. Whereas before with correlational, we're literally just measuring time on Facebook and measuring GPA and then looking for a pattern in those measures. So what about differential research? Because we talked about in chapter 10, remember that differential and correlational look very similar. Differential, remember, is a non-experimental research strategy. And again, the reason that it is different than correlational is because we're looking at a difference between groups. We're comparing groups again. We're separating them into groups. So we cannot do cause and effect relationship with either differential or correlational. That's something where they're similar. That's a part where they look very similar. There's no manipulation. So that is why we cannot do cause and effect, and also why they seem very similar. But they are different because differential is a non-experimental strategy, not correlational, because we're still separating it into groups. It's trying to look like an experiment, but it is not, right, because we're not truly manipulating anything. But we are comparing groups of scores, which is we don't separate into groups for correlational. So it says here at the bottom, correlational is looking for patterns within the scores. As I mentioned, differential is examining the groups and comparing the groups. So what does this look like in like a real life example? Just like I did with experimental and correlational. So if we wanted to know, if a research question was the relationship between self-esteem and academic performance, we could study that in both of these ways. If we wanted to study it in a differential way, using a differential strategy, we would separate the participants, gosh, I couldn't think of the word participants, into a high self-esteem group and a low self-esteem group. And then we would compare those groups on academic performance to see if there was a difference. Now you see, we didn't manipulate self-esteem, so it's not an experimental strategy, but we did separate them into groups and compare groups. So that is why it is differential. For correlational, we would literally just measure self-esteem and measure academic performance and compare both of those measurements looking for patterns. That's it. There's no separating into groups or anything like that. We literally just want to see, I mean, if with all of the people that we measure their self-esteem and their academic performance, is there a pattern there? And so hopefully that kind of helps you separate all of that in your brain. This reflection activity here, again, you can screenshot this and talk about this with, at another time, with someone else, or, just think about it in your head. But this is, again, trying to get you to think of real life examples of correlations. Correlations are literally everywhere. If you can think of two things, two variables, two things in your life that as one increases, the other increases, or as one decreases, the other decreases, or as one increases, the other decreases, and vice versa, that's a correlation, right? Right there. That in essence is what it is. So hopefully thinking that through helps you guys understand correlations a little bit more. Um, so let's do the learning check really quickly. Which of the following is a defining characteristic of the correlational research strategy? Um, so research is conducted in field settings rather than in a laboratory. Well, we already discussed you can do it either place, so that's not true. The intent is simply to describe behaviors. Well, we already said the intent is we're looking at relationships, so that's not it. And then this third one says the intent is to demonstrate the relationship between variables. Well, that sounds right. And then the last one says the other three options are all defining. Well, we already said the first two were not right. So it has to be the third one. Again, the goal of correlational research is to demonstrate a relationship exists. We want to see if there's a relationship and describe it. Okay. Which of the following commonly occurs in a correlational study? One variable is measured. Well, one variable is measured, but so is the other. Two variables are measured. Yes, two variables are definitely measured in a correlational study. One individual is described in great detail. No, that sounds more like a case study. One individual is treated. Well, treatment, we know that gets a keyword. That means there's manipulation. That means experimental, so that's not correct. So obviously the answer is two variables are measured. Remember, that is the main difference between correlational and anything else, is that we have both variables we're interested in are being measured. They are both measurable variables. We aren't separating into groups or anything like that. We're just measuring. Researcher would like to examine the relationship between self-esteem and academic performance for high school students. Instead of a correlational study, what other kind of study could they use? So we talked about this. We just talked about this example of self-esteem and academic performance. So remember the correlational study, we would just measure self-esteem, we would just measure academic performance, and we would see if there's a pattern between the two sets of measurements. If we wanted to do it a different way, it says a differential study comparing academic performance scores for a group of high self-esteem and low self-esteem. Well, that's what we talked about right there, right? We talked about you would just put them in the high self-esteem group and a low self-esteem group and compare the academic performance. So that is definitely a possibility, but let's look at the other ones. An experimental study comparing academic, so that's exactly the same as the first answer, but it says experimental instead of differential. Well, we know that's not experimental, right? Because self-esteem isn't manipulated. They just took the already established self-esteem. So if that's like a participant variable. They took what's already existed, self-esteem, and just separated them into groups based on their scores. That wasn't any kind of manipulation of self-esteem. So it would not be experimental there. And then a descriptive study examining self-esteem for a group of students during the top 25% of their high school class. Well, first of all, we're not even talking about descriptive studies, but second of all, if we're only looking at the top 25% of the class, that is not giving us the full picture, which would not be enabling us to examine the relationship between self-esteem and academic performance if we're only looking at the people who score high. So obviously the answer is the first one, differential study comparing academic performance scores for high and low group. All right, so hopefully that helps introduce you guys to correlational research strategy. And that is it for the first section. And we will talk about the data and statistics for correlations in the next video.